Rose stood at the observation deck of her starship, her iridescent scales shifting colors as she gazed at the blue planet below. Earth was nothing special at first glance, just another world with primitive life forms she had encountered during her thousand-year search for worthy allies. As the supreme diplomat of the Celestial Alliance, Rose had visited countless civilizations. Most proved disappointing, lacking the qualities her advanced species required. Her people were dying, their sun failing, and they needed partners who could help them survive the coming darkness. "Another waste of time," she muttered, her translator converting her musical language into basic data streams. Her crew knew better than to respond. They had seen this scenario play out hundreds of times before. Arrive, observe, leave disappointed. But protocol demanded they study each civilization for at least one full planetary rotation. Rose directed her ship into a stealth orbit, hidden from Earth's primitive detection systems. She settled into her observation chair, ready for another boring day of watching inferior beings stumble through their lives. The first images from the surface made her pause. A massive earthquake had struck a coastal city, sending buildings crashing down and waves rushing inland. Rose had seen natural disasters before. They were common across the galaxy. What caught her attention was the response. Instead of fleeing, humans were running toward the danger. Emergency workers dove into collapsed buildings. Citizens formed human chains to rescue strangers from the floodwaters. Even children helped, carrying supplies and comforting the injured. "Fascinating," Rose whispered, leaning forward. "Show me more." The ship's AI focused on one particular human, a man named James. He worked tirelessly, pulling people from rubble, treating injuries, organizing rescue efforts. Hours passed, and still he worked. When someone tried to make him rest, he simply shook his head and moved on to the next task. Rose's species valued efficiency above all else. They would have calculated the odds of survival and saved only those with the highest probability of living. But James and his fellow humans seemed to ignore such calculations. They fought for every life, no matter how hopeless it seemed. "He's going to collapse if he continues," one of Rose's crew members noted. Indeed, James was showing signs of extreme fatigue. His movements were slower, less coordinated. Yet when cries came from another collapsed building, he immediately responded. The structure was unstable, likely to fall at any moment. Rose's sensors indicated a 92% chance of complete collapse within minutes. By her species standards, attempting rescue was foolish, a waste of resources that could be better spent elsewhere. James didn't hesitate. He crawled into the narrow space between fallen beams, following the sounds of a trapped child. Rose watched, fascinated, as he ignored his own safety, ignored logic, ignored everything except the need to help. The building groaned. Debris shifted. Rose's crew tensed, expecting to witness the human's death. But James emerged moments later, clutching the small form against his chest. The child was alive, crying but largely unharmed. Instead of seeking medical attention for himself, James handed the child to paramedics and turned back toward the disaster zone. Only when his legs finally gave out did others force him to rest. "Initial assessment complete," the ship's AI announced. "This species ranks low on technological advancement, military capability, and social organization. Recommendation: mark as unsuitable for alliance and proceed to next candidate." Rose remained silent, her eyes fixed on the scenes below. She watched as humans continued working through the night, refusing to give up on their search for survivors. She saw them share food, shelter, and comfort with strangers. She observed their determination, their resilience, their inexplicable drive to help others at any cost. "Belay that recommendation," she said finally. "There's something here we don't understand yet. Something important." Her crew exchanged worried glances. They had never seen their supreme diplomat countermand an AI assessment before. "We will extend our observation period," Rose announced. "I want to understand what drives them, especially that one." She pointed to James, who had finally fallen asleep while sitting against a broken wall, covered in dust and blood, yet somehow looking peaceful. Perhaps, she mused, we have been measuring the wrong things all along. Over the next 2 weeks, Rose found herself increasingly drawn to observing human behavior. She paid special attention to James, who had returned to his normal life after the earthquake crisis. Her advanced surveillance systems allowed her to watch him without detection, though she knew her superiors would disapprove of such focused study on a single subject. James worked as a teacher at a small school. Rose watched him arrive early each morning, greeting every student by name. When one child struggled with math, he stayed late to help. When another forgot lunch, he shared his own. These small acts puzzled Rose. There was no logical benefit to such behavior. His actions decrease his own resources and time efficiency, she noted in her personal log. Yet he continues to help others without gaining anything in return. One rainy morning, Rose observed James stop his car to help an elderly man whose vehicle had broken down. The man had nothing to offer in exchange, but James spent an hour getting soaked while fixing the problem. He arrived late to work, his clothes dripping, yet he was smiling. Incomprehensible, Rose muttered, her scales shifting to a confused purple hue. In her own society, every action was calculated for maximum benefit. Resources were never wasted. Relationships were formed only when mutually advantageous. The weak were left to their fate. It was simply the natural order. Yet humans seemed to defy this logic at every turn. During lunch break, Rose watched James share his food with a stray dog. Later, he donated money to a stranger's medical fund. On his way home, he stopped to help a lost child find their parents. None of these actions brought him any obvious benefit. Supreme Diplomat, one of her crew members interrupted. The Council demands an update on potential military capabilities. Rose waved him away. Tell them we're still gathering data. She turned her attention back to James, who was now visiting an elderly neighbor. The woman appeared to have no family, no resources to share, nothing to offer. Yet James spent hours helping her with household tasks, listening to her stories, making her laugh. Their inefficiency should have destroyed them long ago. Rose commented to her ship's eye. How have they survived as a species? The AI displayed charts showing human history, wars, disasters, plagues, and countless catastrophes that should have ended them. Yet they had endured, even thrived. Perhaps, Rose thought, there was something her logical mind was missing. One evening, she watched James organize a community meeting. The topic was helping families affected by the recent earthquake. People brought food, clothes, and offers of shelter. Nobody asked what they would get in return. Nobody calculated the cost versus benefit. They're stronger together, Rose realized suddenly. Not because of efficiency or resources, but because they care for each other. The concept was alien to her. Her species had evolved beyond such emotional attachments, seeing them as primitive and counterproductive. Yet watching James and his community, she began to wonder if her people had lost something important in their pursuit of pure logic. Her scales shifted to a thoughtful blue as she watched James comfort a crying student. The child had failed a test, and rather than marking him as inadequate and moving on, James spent time explaining how to improve, offering encouragement and support. Perhaps, Rose wrote in her log, what we consider weakness is actually their greatest strength. The day's observations were interrupted by an urgent alert. Her sensors detected a dangerous gas leak in James's neighborhood. Safety protocols strictly forbade interference with primitive species, but Rose found herself calculating the probability of mass casualties. James was walking home, unaware of the danger. Protocol said to observe only. Logic said to protect their secret presence. Everything Rose had learned in her centuries of diplomatic service said to let events unfold naturally. But for the first time in her long life, Rose felt something override her logical programming, an unfamiliar sensation that humans would call concern. Prepare for emergency intervention, she announced to her shocked crew. and may the Council forgive me for what I'm about to do. Rose's ship's cloaking shield hummed as she made her decision. The gas leak was spreading rapidly through the underground pipes, and James was walking straight into the danger zone. Her sensors showed the concentration was reaching lethal levels. "Emergency transport now," she commanded. Before her crew could protest, Rose beamed herself directly onto the street. Her iridescent form materialized in front of James, her scales glowing bright red in morning. He stopped, eyes widening at the sight of the alien being before him. "You must turn back immediately," Rose said, her translator converting her musical tones into English. "There's a gas leak ahead that will kill everyone in this area." Instead of running in terror as she expected, James simply stared at her with fascination. "You're not from around here, are you?" "This is not the time for questions," Rose replied, her scales flickering with urgency. "The entire neighborhood needs to be evacuated." To her surprise, James pulled out his phone and dialed emergency services. He quickly reported the gas leak, then started running from house to house, warning people to leave. Rose stood frozen, amazed by his immediate shift into action without questioning her appearance or motives. "Help me warn them," he called back to her. Rose knew she had already shattered dozens of non-interference protocols. But watching James risk his life to save others, she made another decision that would change both their worlds forever. She joined him in the evacuation effort. Together, they cleared the neighborhood just as emergency crews arrived. The gas company found the leak and prevented what could have been a massive explosion. From her ship's readings, Rose knew they had saved exactly 247 lives. Once the immediate danger passed, James turned to her. She expected fear, demands for explanation, or even aggression. Instead, he smiled and said, "Thank you. I'm James. Would you like some coffee?" "Coffee?" Rose's translator struggled with the concept. "It's a drink. You probably saved everyone in this neighborhood. The least I can do is offer you a cup of coffee." Rose's crew was frantically signaling for her to return. The Council would be furious. She had revealed herself to a primitive species, interfered with their natural development, and violated the prime directive of non-interference. "I should not be here," she said. "But you are here," James replied simply. "And I have so many questions, like how did you know about the gas leak? And why did you warn us instead of just watching?" Rose's scales shifted to a confused yellow. "You're not afraid." "Oh, I'm terrified," James laughed. "But I'm also curious. And grateful. Those are all human things you probably don't understand, but I'd like to explain them to you. Over coffee." Before Rose could respond, her ship's emergency beacon activated. The Council was demanding her immediate return. She had minutes at most before they would forcibly recall her. "I must go," she said. "The consequences of my actions here will be severe." James looked concerned. "Will you be in trouble for helping us?" "My species doesn't believe in interfering with developing civilizations. We observe only. I broke our highest law by revealing myself and preventing those deaths." "That's the craziest thing I've ever heard," James said. "You saved hundreds of lives. How could that be wrong?" Rose's scales flickered with something new, doubt about her society's rigid rules. Perhaps some laws should be broken. The recall beam began to activate. Rose had seconds left. "Will I see you again?" James asked. "I don't know," Rose answered honestly. "But you have taught me something important today. Sometimes the most logical action is not the right one." As she began to fade in the recall beam, James called out, "If you can come back, I'll keep the coffee warm." Rose's last glimpse was of James waving, still smiling despite having his entire worldview shattered. As she rematerialized on her ship, she knew she faced serious consequences. But for the first time in her long life, she felt something her species had evolved beyond. She felt certain she had done the right thing, regardless of the cost. Her scales shifted to a determined green as her ship prepared to return to the Council. This wasn't the end of her connection with Earth. it was just the beginning. The council chamber glowed with cold blue light as Rose stood before the 7 high judges of her species. Their scales rippled with disapproval, casting shifting shadows across the ancient hall. Supreme Diplomat Rose, the first judge's voice echoed. You stand accused of violating our most sacred law. You revealed yourself to a primitive species and interfered with their natural development. Rose stood tall, her scales maintaining a steady green of conviction. I saved 247 lives. Lives that were not yours to save, the second judge countered. For 10,000 years, we have observed the galaxy's species without interference. It is the foundation of our civilization. Then perhaps, Rose said, it is time for our foundation to evolve. Gasps echoed through the chamber. No one had ever challenged the council's wisdom so directly. Show us, the first judge commanded. What could possibly justify such a breach of protocol? Rose activated her recorded memories, projecting them into the chamber center. Images of James helping others played out, his tireless work during the earthquake, his kindness to students, his immediate action to save his neighbors when warned of danger. This human, Rose explained, represents something we have lost. They help others without calculation of benefit. They risk themselves for strangers. They grow stronger through cooperation rather than competition. These are primitive emotional responses. The third judge dismissed. We evolved beyond such weaknesses eons ago. Did we evolve? Rose questioned. Or did we stagnate? She showed more images, humans celebrating together, supporting each other through hardships, building communities based on trust and mutual care. Our sun is dying, Rose continued. We've searched the galaxy for species advanced enough to help us, but perhaps we've been searching for the wrong qualities. You suggest we should ally with primitives who barely understand space travel. The fourth judge's scales flickered with derision. I suggest we should learn from them, Rose countered. Their emotional connections don't weaken them, they strengthen them. They survive disasters that should destroy them because they faced them together. The fifth judge leaned forward. You've spent too much time observing them. You're compromised. I'm enlightened, Rose corrected. We call ourselves advanced, yet we can't save ourselves. These humans, these primitives, they save each other every day. The chamber fell silent. Rose projected one final image, James, standing in the rain, waving goodbye as she disappeared, still offering friendship to an alien who had disrupted his entire understanding of the universe. This is your defense, the first judge asked. Stories of primitive kindness. This is my evidence that we've been wrong, Rose declared. We've confused advancement with improvement. These humans, despite their technological limitations, understand something we've forgotten: the strength of connection. The judges conferred silently, their scales shifting through patterns of deliberation. Finally, the first judge spoke. You leave us no choice. You are hereby stripped of your title as Supreme Diplomat. You will be exiled from our worlds. Rose's scales remained steady. And if I choose to return to Earth, then you choose permanent exile, the second judge stated. You will never be welcomed among our people again. Rose looked at the image of James, still frozen in the chamber center. She thought of her 1,000 years of diplomatic service, her status among her people, everything she would lose. Then she thought of the simple offer of coffee, of kindness without calculation, of strength through connection rather than isolation. Then I choose exile, she declared, and I choose to believe that someday you will understand why. The chamber erupted in chaos, but Rose stood calm. For the first time in her long life, she felt truly certain of her path. As she walked out of the chamber, her scales shifted to a bright, determined blue, the color of a new dawn. She had lost her position, her status, and her place among her people, but she had gained something far more valuable: understanding of a truth her species had forgotten. She sent a message to her ship, set course for Earth. After all, she had promised to explain human emotions to her people, And somewhere on that blue planet, a cup of coffee was waiting. 3 months after her exile, Rose's ship touched down in a secluded forest clearing near James's town. This time, she came openly, her ship visible to Earth's tracking systems. Within hours, government vehicles surrounded the landing site. James was among the first civilians allowed through the security perimeter, having been identified from Rose's previous contact. He walked toward her ship carrying 2 coffee cups, just as he promised. "You came back," he said, offering her a steaming cup. Rose's scales shifted to a warm purple as she accepted the drink. "I lost everything to return here." "Then we better make it worth it," James replied with a smile. Over the next few weeks, Rose became Earth's first official alien ambassador. But more importantly, she became James's student in understanding humanity. Each day brought new lessons in emotions and connections that her species had long forgotten. One morning, they sat in James's classroom after his students had left. "Explain to me again about friendship," Rose requested. "My people form alliances based on mutual benefit, but this seems different." "Friendship isn't about benefit," James explained, grading papers while they talked. "It's about caring for someone whether they can help you or not." "That seems inefficient," Rose noted, her scales rippling with confusion. "Most important things are," James laughed. "Like how I spend extra time with struggling students instead of just teaching the quick learners, or how people donate to strangers online, or how you gave up everything to come back here." Rose considered this. "My people would say I made an illogical choice." "Did you?" James asked, looking up from his work. Her scales shifted to a thoughtful blue. "No, I don't regret it, but I can't explain why in terms my species would understand." "Then maybe it's time they learned a new way of understanding," James suggested. Rose began sending regular reports back to her homeworld, knowing they would be received even if never acknowledged. She documented human interactions, explaining concepts like empathy, friendship, and trust. At first, she wrote in the clinical language of her people, but gradually, her reports took on more emotional tones. She described a student giving away their lunch to a hungry classmate. She detailed how humans celebrated each other's successes and supported each other through failures. She explained how their apparent weakness, emotional attachment, actually made them remarkably resilient. One day, while helping James organize a community fundraiser for a family whose house had burned down, Rose received an unexpected response from her homeworld. A small group of her people had read her reports and wanted to learn more. "They're interested," she told James, her scales flickering with excitement. "They want to understand." "Understanding takes time," James reminded her. "Look how long it took you to appreciate coffee." Rose sipped her now-favorite drink, remembering her first taste. "I thought it was bitter poison. Now I understand it's about more than the drink. It's about sharing moments together." "Exactly," James smiled. "Sometimes the hardest things to explain are the most important to understand." As they worked together setting up tables for the fundraiser, Rose watched the community come together. People brought food, donated clothes and furniture, offered temporary housing, all without expecting anything in return. "My people believe they're advanced because they evolved beyond emotions," Rose said. "But watching humans, I think we didn't evolve beyond emotions. We just forgot how to feel them." James paused in his work. "Is that why you really came back? To remember?" Rose's scales shifted through several colors before settling on a deep gold, a new color she'd never displayed before. "I came back because for the first time in centuries, I felt something worth feeling." "And what was that?" "Hope," she answered simply. "Hope that my people can learn what humanity never forgot. That true advancement isn't about moving beyond emotions, but about understanding how to use them wisely." As the community gathered for the fundraiser, Rose sent another report to her homeworld. This time, she didn't try to explain in logical terms. Instead, she simply shared what she felt, hoping that somewhere among her people, others would remember how to feel too. The warning came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Rose's ship detected it first. a massive solar flare heading toward Earth, far larger than anything in recorded history. At the same time, her homeworld sent an urgent message. Their dying sun had entered its final phase. "We have two catastrophes approaching," Rose explained to James in his classroom after hours. "My people face extinction within months. Earth faces devastating damage within days." James looked at the projected data. "Can your technology protect Earth?" "No." Rose's scales darkened to gray. "We barely have enough energy to protect our own world. The logical choice would be to use our remaining resources to save as many of my people as possible. But I can't abandon Earth. Not after everything I've learned here." Rose's scales swirled with conflicting colors. James stood quiet for a moment, then asked, "What if we didn't have to choose?" "Explain." "Your people have the technology, but not enough power. Earth has power plants worldwide. What if we combined our resources?" Rose's scales flickered. "The logistics would be impossible. We'd need to coordinate thousands of power stations globally, redirect massive amounts of energy through technology that doesn't exist yet, and do it all in less than 3 days. Sounds like we better get started then." James smiled. What followed was unprecedented. Rose revealed the full situation to Earth's governments. Instead of panic, she witnessed something remarkable. Humanity doing what it did best: coming together. Nations that had been enemies shared power grids. Scientists worked around the clock to adapt Earth's technology to Rose's specifications. Communities organized to handle evacuations and support services. "This defies all logic," Rose told James as they coordinated efforts from her ship. "The chances of success are minimal." "Since when has that ever stopped humans?" James replied, directing emergency response teams. Rose's people initially refused Earth's help, clinging to their belief in self-reliance. But as they watched humans worldwide working together to save both worlds, something changed. For the first time in millennia, they began to remember what it meant to connect with others. The day the solar flare hit, every power station on Earth diverted energy to Rose's shield technology. It wasn't enough. The shields began to fail. "We need more power." Rose's scales flashed urgent red. Then something unexpected happened. Her homeworld, watching Earth's efforts, made a decision that went against all their logical protocols. They diverted power from their core reserves, power they'd been saving for their own survival, and channeled it to Earth's shields. The combined energy was enough. The solar flare washed over Earth, but the shields held. In working together, both worlds had survived. But they weren't finished. Earth, grateful for the alien world's sacrifice, immediately offered to help save Rose's people. Human scientists had discovered a way to stabilize their dying sun using the same technology they'd developed for the shields. "It won't work," Rose's people insisted. "The calculations show the probability of success is too low." "Since when has that ever stopped anyone?" Rose replied, her scales glowing with newfound confidence. James gathered international teams of scientists and engineers. Rose's people, inspired by Earth's determination, began sharing technological secrets they'd hoarded for centuries. Together, they found a solution that neither world could have discovered alone. As the combined human and alien crews worked to save Rose's son, she stood with James in his classroom one last time. "You know what I realized," she said, her scales shimmering with new understanding. "Logic told us both worlds would die. Emotion told us to try anyway. And by trying together, we found a way to save everyone." James nodded. "Sometimes the most logical choice is to ignore logic completely." "My people are beginning to understand that," Rose replied. "They're learning that strength isn't just about power or technology. It's about being willing to help others, even when the odds seem impossible." Outside, the sun was setting on a changed Earth, one that now knew it wasn't alone in the universe, and more importantly, knew that the greatest power wasn't in technology or logic, but in the willingness to work together. Rose's scales settled into that new golden color she discovered since coming to Earth, the color of hope. 5 years after the dual world crisis, Earth and Rose's homeworld had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. The first joint colonization project was underway, with humans and aliens working side by side to build settlements on suitable planets. Rose stood in her old classroom at James's school, now transformed into the first alien-human cultural center. Her scales glowed with pride as she watched children from both species playing together in the yard. "Remember when you first arrived, thinking we were too primitive to be worth your time?" James teased, joining her at the window. "I remember believing that emotions made you weak," Rose replied. "Now look at us. My people are learning to laugh again." Indeed, the change in Rose's species had been remarkable. After centuries of suppressing emotions in favor of pure logic, they were rediscovering feelings they'd forgotten they could have. Young ones were developing new scale colors never seen before, expressing emotions their ancestors had abandoned. "Today's a big day," James reminded her. "First official cultural exchange program launches." Rose nodded. Hundreds of her people had volunteered to live among humans, while brave humans had chosen to stay on her homeworld. Both species were learning from each other, growing stronger together. "The Council wants me to resume my position as Supreme Diplomat," Rose said, her scales shifting to thoughtful blue. "They say I was right all along. Will you accept?" "I've declined," she answered. "I'm more needed here, teaching both our peoples how to understand each other. Besides, I've grown rather fond of teaching." James smiled. They had both witnessed incredible changes. Earth had advanced technologically, while Rose's people had advanced emotionally. Both worlds were stronger for it. In the schoolyard, a young alien fell and scraped its scales. Before any adult could react, a human child rushed over to help, offering comfort without hesitation. The alien child's scales shifted to a new color, one that meant trust. "That's the real evolution," Rose observed. "Not the technology we've shared, but the way we've learned to care for each other." The evening brought a celebration. The 5th anniversary of the crisis that had united two worlds. Humans and aliens gathered in the town square, sharing food, stories, and friendship. Rose watched as her people attempted to dance to human music, their scales creating light shows that matched the rhythms. "We've created something entirely new," James said, watching the celebrations. "Not just human, not just alien, but something better than either alone." Rose's scales shifted to that special gold color, now known among her people as the color of hope. "My ancestors would say we've contaminated ourselves with primitive emotions." "And what would you say?" "I would say we've remembered what they forgot. That true advancement isn't about rising above emotions, but about learning to use them wisely." As night fell, both species gathered for a tradition they'd created together: the telling of stories. Children from both worlds sat mesmerized as tales were shared of how two different species had saved each other, not through superior technology or pure logic, but through cooperation and care. "Tell us about the first meeting," a young alien called out, scales flickering with excitement. Rose looked at James, who nodded. Together, they began the story that had started it all. About an alien who thought she was superior, a human who taught her otherwise, and how that meeting had changed everything. "And that's why we celebrate," Rose concluded, her scales glowing brightly. "Not just because we survived, but because we learned that the strongest force in the universe isn't technology or logic or even evolution. It's the ability to care for each other, to help each other, to make each other better." As the stars came out, humans and aliens sat together, sharing hopes and dreams for their joint future. Rose realized that her greatest diplomatic achievement hadn't been saving two worlds. It had been helping two species remember that they weren't so different after all. She turned to James. Was it worth it? All the changes, all the challenges. James looked at the gathered crowd, at the children playing, at the two species becoming something new together. Some things are always worth it. Rose's scales shifted to that golden hue one more time. She understood now. It wasn't just hope she was feeling. It was home.